Just in case you don't know HARC and didn't understand what John was talking about, we are a research organization founded by George Mitchell. We're up in the Woodlands. We work on sustainability issues, focusing on energy, air, and water. And we're still working on Galveston Bay. Who's here from Galveston Bay Foundation? Isn't there? Yeah, okay, Matt's here. Do you guys still have a project going with us on wetlands? Isn't there a second phase coming along on that? Yeah, okay, all right. So now, what I know about ecosystem services started with a project funded by the Galveston Bay Estuary Program back when Helen Drummond was the executive director. They were worried about being able to make a case for the protection and conservation of natural resources and wetlands and things like that without being able to put a value on it. And then I started working with a guy named Greg Bidinger, and I'm sorry Greg is not here today, but Greg came out of ExxonMobil and had learned about ecosystem services and trying to convince that behemoth of a company that they didn't have to develop everything, they didn't have to sell off all of their land resources, which they had a lot of, that they could actually make an economic case for doing things that protected those resources, and in particular the wetlands that they had. So a lot of these concepts go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was published in 2005 with definitions of ecosystems and ecosystem services. The main thing that you need to know about ecosystem services is that it's all about benefits to people. Now everybody's worried about putting dollar signs on things. Some of those benefits you're never going to be able to put a dollar sign on. I know that Jim Blackburn speaks in spiritual terms about Galveston Bay and the Texas coast. You're never going to be able to put a dollar sign on that. Okay, so there are benefits that we can talk about, we can try to express the support that those benefits have from the people. Can't put dollars on them. The ones that you can put dollars on that are easy are things like food and fiber, timber, fuels, the productive part of the ecosystems. This is the system that was developed in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The regulatory stuff, we can try to put dollar signs on these things based on replacement of concrete and steel. So if you're talking about waste treatment, okay, the city of Beaumont uses 100 acres of wetlands that were created wetlands in place of tertiary treatment on a wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so we know what it costs to build tertiary treatment for a wastewater plant based on the number of millions of gallons per day, and we can replace that with wetlands. So you can get that. In terms of climate regulation, we know that we have an urban heat island in Houston. We can extrapolate, if you work with people over at the School of Public Health or UTMB, into number of heat stress deaths during periods of high heat during our famous summers. And so if you were to reduce the urban heat island by putting wetlands in strategic places and replacing concrete with those wetlands, or protecting those wetlands and not putting concrete there, you can sort of get an idea in terms of health benefits. Now, health benefits are notoriously hard to put numbers on, but people do it all the time, so you can assume that you can find some expert that'll do that for you. Nutrient regulation, there are ecosystem services markets over in Chesapeake Bay area where there is a market going on in terms of the restoration of riparian ecosystems so that the stormwater is treated before it hits the Susquehanna River, and you reduce the amount of nutrients flowing down in the Chesapeake Bay. So there are a lot of examples. These are going to be, like I said, you're not going to put dollar signs on those. These are awfully hard to put dollar signs on. Now, that was the UN. This is the EPA, and this just sort of boggles the mind, but the EPA wants to know exactly who's benefiting and exactly how, and so they developed a classification system for final ecosystem goods and services that has, I think, 344 classes of final ecosystem goods and services. Yes, it boggles the mind that they actually want to implement a system like this, but you know, when it comes to wetlands and estuaries, these are the attributes, and you have lines going from each of these attributes to each of those types of human beneficiaries because we want an accounting system. Not quite sure that we'll ever, you know, get to a fully understood accounting system for this, but that's the way that the EPA is headed. So the problem with all this, of course, is that it's very expensive to do this for every location, and even if you could do it for every location, it's hard to know what the temporal scale should be. So right now, the usual approach to putting a value on ecosystem services is simply to borrow a study that was done someplace else. We know that there have been studies done in New England on the value of wetlands around Boston and, you know, in Massachusetts. And people will borrow those numbers and talk about the transfer of that valuation system to Texas. I think that's problematic. And I'll show you in great detail, based on watersheds around Houston, why that's problematic. Because valuation system really changes a lot going from one watershed to the next. I'll show you how it changes going from the Trinity River to Brays Bayou. And it's a big difference in terms of the values of certain services. Also, we're going to focus in on wetlands in the context of avoidance of flood damage. Well, okay, floods are episodes. How many floods? If we're talking about putting a value on wetlands, floods are very difficult to predict. We know that they're a property of this climate, but how far out into the future are we going to talk about the avoidance of flood damage based on saving an acre of wetland in some watershed around Houston? And then the short-term, long-term thing, I'll talk about the short-term nature of profits from selling and converting land and the long-term risk and costs that are associated with that. The profit is on a short term, all of the damages tend to be on a long term, and it's hard to draw lines between them. Now, hedonic behavior, I don't know whether you've run across that one before. I had to befriend an economist before I heard about hedonic valuation, but that's about human behavior and human preferences. So sometimes you try to place a value on something by asking people what they would pay for it. So, and in fact, it's actually true. There's a lot of money raised for protecting the Amazonian rainforest based on the hedonic value that people place on having a rainforest. They make contributions to nonprofits that take that money and then do things in terms of protecting land that the people who donated the money are never going to see. So that's a method that people debated a lot, but when you get to the ecosystem services associated with aesthetics and spirituality and things like that, you don't have any alternative. You've got to go to hedonic valuation. Now, this one, to be fair, if you convert wetlands to farmland, you have to do a fair evaluation, and the productive nature of farmland and the uncertainties associated with wetland benefits can make it really hard to show that it's not a good idea to make that conversion. And then I liked the conversion of wetland to golf course issue because recreational values can really skew the whole thing. We've spent a long time looking at fishing in the Galveston Bay, Texas coast area, and if you compare commercial fishing, which feeds people, with recreational fishing, the economic value of recreational fishing is way up here and the value of commercial fishing is way down here, right, Bill? Yes. Okay. So there are some issues that make ecologists like John Jacob really uncomfortable in terms of applying this. All right, let's get focused on wetlands and the benefits. And we had a workshop years ago about wetlands and water resources and ecosystem services. So this is kind of a shopping list. Stormwater retention, which is the one I'll focus in on. Nutrient and pollutant assimilation. The Galveston Bay Estuary Program paid Baylor to look at local wetlands, and they have a number in terms of how much nitrogen and phosphorus is assimilated as stormwater moves through local prairie pothole wetlands. Habitat. Habitat's a kind of a messy concept. It's got cultural values associated with it. It's got regulatory values associated with it because it's involved in regulating the populations of a number of organisms that use it. And it's also got potential cost avoidance associated with it, because if you are maintaining that habitat, even if you're maintaining it for birds, you're still doing some flood avoidance. And then heat island amelioration, which is one that, again, we could probably make a case for avoidance of death from heat stroke, but it's kind of hard to do. Now, loss of land value if undeveloped. Mary talked about most of the land in Texas is owned by private property owners. Okay, so people own these prairie mosaics with wetlands in them with the assumption that they're going to use them for something. And so they value that land in terms of either the productive nature of it or the potential to sell it to somebody who will probably develop it. If you try to maintain it as a wetland, they're losing value. It's sort of an easy equation. If you try to maintain those wetlands within that complex, you're going to increase the cost of development because you're going to have to route roads and subdivisions and everything around those wetlands. And right now, we have a fairly weak regulatory system for dealing with those issues. If it were strong, then we wouldn't be able to show you the numbers we're going to show you. Okay, here's the blob of Houston. There are cities that beat us in terms of the urban sprawl rankings these days, but I still maintain that we've been doing urban sprawl longer than most of them, so we deserve some kind of title. Now, this purple is the area that shows up as wetlands. I know we argue with John all the time about this. He uses the Fish and Wildlife Service wetland maps. We use the classification from NOAA CCAP, which every 5 years does an analysis of the satellite images and provides maps like this so that we can do the coastal area of Texas. Okay, the absence of purple is what I want you to note in there. Now, this area is classically prairie wetland mosaic, and if you go back to the construction of Rice University and read some of those accounts, it was a mess. I mean, there's a book about the early settlers of Texas, and they could hardly get their prairies across, their wagons across the prairie in the spring because they were such nasty messes of wetlands. These are the 100-year floodplains. And the one thing I want you to think about the last one where the big white blob was, and then look in here. These wetlands, these floodplains have no wetlands in them. That's kind of unnatural to have a floodplain area that is absent wetlands. And the reason those are absent wetlands is because we basically developed it all. Okay, we put our houses right up next to the edge of the bios. It's all developed. So, Harris County, if you look at the whole county, is currently 16.7% floodplain. That is an aberration in terms of the counties that surround it. Most of those are 21 to 46% floodplain. So not only have we developed the floodplain, we've also shrunk it. From 96 to 2010, based on our calculations, and I think we've checked this with John's group, Lower Galveston Bay Watershed lost about 14,000 acres of wetlands. That's the 5 counties around Galveston Bay. That's 0.15% per year. Now, has anybody heard of a federal policy we have about no net loss of wetlands? Doesn't quite compute, does it? So now let's talk about the types of wetlands. We get pretty good protection. Our figures, the satellite images that we get show that we're doing a pretty good job of protecting the fringing wetlands. If somebody in a boat can see a wetland, it's probably been pretty well protected. So the fringing wetlands around Galveston Bay, the wetlands that are typically along the rivers, those are doing okay. The things that we're losing are the ones called palestrin wetlands, which are out in the prairie. Okay, they're the isolated wetlands that lost their protection with the Supreme Court decisions. Now, the wetlands that we have, even though they're not very impressive looking, they're usually small, half an acre to 25 acres. They're usually not very deep. They might get as much as 16 inches deep, but they store most of the precipitation and the stormwater runoff that goes into them. Most of it's lost either by sinking into the ground or by evaporating. And this is what they look like. This is a John Jacob picture right here. So this is the cash crop right here. Okay. So, you know, you have to develop an appreciation for them. That I think they're pretty. John thinks they're pretty. But they're kind of hard to see, and they're not particularly impressive. This is the model that Baylor came up with. Well, not a model, actually. This is a record from one of the wetlands that they studied. This is a 1 foot deep wetland. Okay, and there's Hurricane Ike, so the record gets interrupted a little bit. But you can see that the water spills out. That's the water coming out. Here's the water coming out. 3 times in 2 years, the water, actually probably 4 times because that was Hurricane Ike, the water came out of that wetland. Other than that, it absorbed and evaporated all the precipitation that went into it and the water that rolled into it. So it did a pretty good job of retaining water, natural system. So we've got this physical model of stormwater retention. Now, what are we going to do with it? Well, there's 2 ways to look at this. You could do the cost avoidance. How much would it cost to build a retention pond for Harris County Flood Control, to build a retention pond that would replace that? Or what's the value of avoided property damage if we just protect it? Okay, so I'm going to focus in on the property damage because flooding is one of those things. If you're in the medical sciences, you scare people with cancer. If you're in the wetland ecology stuff around here, you scare people with floods, all right? So we're going to talk about flooding, and I hope it really strikes some sort of emotional response here. We could talk about the ecological production functions. These are the 2 types of models that we really need to develop these valuation systems. So, and we could probably do this, the value of vegetation growth. So given a certain amount of biomass produced, how much nutrient does it sequester, how much carbon, how much in the way of heavy metals and things like that are actually sequestered by the growth of that vegetation. This is the way that the science is developing. I told you EPA is making it complicated in terms of classification. The people who do this for their research are saying, okay, we need the biophysical models. These are various kinds of biophysical models. We need the characteristics. These are the things we're going to measure. These are all about the ecological production functions. Here's the EPA stuff. What are the final service indicators that we're going to measure coming out of that? And then here are the human benefits that we're going to place values on, and here are the policies we're going to use to regulate those ecosystem services. Complicated, isn't it? We're not anywhere near there. Okay, people are talking about it, they're theorizing about it, but we're not anywhere near implementing something like this. I just want to remind you that you live in an area with really high rainfall, and floods are something you can't predict them very well, but you can depend on the fact that they're coming again. So these are some that sort of caught my eye when I was looking back at the historical record. Every so often, there's one that's over 12 inches. And this one in April, I got the characteristics out of it, and 5 deaths, 350 homes, $3.5 million in damages. Now that's not an Allison. That won't catch anybody's, that's not going to be a news story for more than maybe a little blip on one of the local TV stations or something. But that kind of damage is episodic. It's going to be repetitive. So let's look at the interface between the system we've got for regulating wetland conversions and this avoidance of flood damage. So we have this Section 404 system, which is about wetland permitting. And Sam Brody down at A&M Galveston has done studies of this system in Texas and in Florida. And I'll show you the Texas part. This is, if you want to delve into the methodology, you'll have to go ask Sam. 11,000 permits between 91 and 2003. He compiled this all in a book, and I don't think he's done it again since then. 42% of them affected the palustrin wetlands, and that number has probably grown since then because of the Supreme Court decisions that reduced the kind of protection that was assumed in the past. And they specify that no, these no longer have the protection they once had. The number of permits in the 100-year floodplain, you would think that we might want to avoid development in the 100-year floodplain, but annually during that time period, 32 to 41% of those wetland conversion permits were in the 100-year floodplain. And looking across the entire Texas coast, I'll show you the spatial extent. This includes rural and urban, $212 of increased flood damage per permit. Statistical analysis, okay? You can't go in and look at a single permit and do cause and effect, but you can do the statistical analysis. So here's what those permits look like when you plot them out on a map. And we're right in here, okay? The demand for development land drives this process. So this is the most intensively developed part of the Texas coast, driving the demand for land conversions, driving the process to get more permits to convert wetlands. And the effect of that, okay, well, this is another study, really old dated study, but I like to go back to it every so often. It was done by National Wildlife Foundation, published in '98, about repetitive flood damage, about the consequences of putting properties into the floodplain around here. We had a couple of hurricanes in there, but 2 hurricanes in that period of, 17 years? 3,681 properties with repetitive flood loss. The one that wins the prize had 14 repetitive losses. 2.9 losses per property over 18 years, 211.5 million paid out. This doesn't include uninsured losses. So the question is, if we had protected the wetlands in those floodplains, what would it have been like under those flooding situations? The number would have been lower, but we don't know how much lower. Now, I would love to be able to tell you that we could do a simple thing like this. We can't, but this is the kind of information you can glean if you go out on the web. Around the Houston area, property in the floodplain can go anywhere from 40,000 an acre up to $1 million an acre. So I took something in the middle. Say somebody sells an acre wetland for 300,000. You only have to put 6 houses there and have them flood to 1 foot in order to exceed that. And if you only flood them to 1 inch, it just takes more floods. And you can exceed the value, the profit that was achieved by selling that land for development. But we don't have a model that allows us even to do this because there's a lot of variation across space. So we know that urban wetlands retain stormwater. We know that they have benefits in terms of assimilating pollutants. We know that they provide habitat for birds. Some of those birds are threatened or endangered. We know that they reduce the heat island effect. We know all these things. We still don't have a good model for putting a value on them. I'm going to show you that high land value is connected to high wetland conversion from some data that we've been working on. One of my folks, Aaron Kinney, is working on this data. This thing about individual profit versus the collective loss is one that I don't know how to get out of that, because our current flood insurance program says that those losses are shared across a wide, basically a nationwide assortment of people when you buy flood insurance under the national program. Now, Congress has passed a law to try to get out of that, but they backed off because it raised, when the property owner takes the whole risk, it raises the cost of insurance tremendously, and I'm not I think eventually we'll get there to where the property owners have to bear the risk. So let's look at it floodplain by floodplain. I don't know whether you can see these numbers very well, but let me run down some of them. The developed land as a percent of total land area. In the lower Trinity, only 3% of the land is developed. Around Baytown and the Cedar Bayou watershed, 12%. Dickinson Bayou, 34%. Armand-Taylor, 64%. When you get down here to Buffalo Bayou, it's 90%, and Brays Bayou, 94% of the land in the Brays Bayou watershed is developed. That doesn't leave any space for wetlands. It really doesn't even leave any space for retention ponds. So that's that kind of development intensity. And the Brays Bayou one, this is wetlands lost to development since '96. Trinity River, we're showing, I mean, there's loss and there's gain. So that one's showing a 0. Cedar Bayou, 4. These are in the middle at 13. Sims Bayou is kind of an anomaly. It's lost a lot of wetlands to development, but I'll talk about the property values. Buffalo Bayou was already developed by '96, and so it's only lost 22% since then. And Brays Bayou has lost 52% since '96. So there weren't many wetlands there in '96, so you didn't have to convert very many to get a 52% wetland loss according to the satellite images. Now look at how property values line up. I mean, Sims Bayou is an anomaly. It only goes around 100,000 to 170,000. There's a lot of poor people living in the Sims Bayou watershed. That's where I grew up. So anyway, I know a lot about that watershed. Trinity River, I used Liberty, Baytown, Dickinson to kind of get some ideas of property values. The more developed the land is, property values go up. And we know about Buffalo Bayou. We've got River Oaks and high dollar subdivisions. And then Brays Bayou, we've got some high dollar subdivisions and some middle class stuff. But as those property values goes up, a flood of an equivalent level is going to, flood damage is going to go up according to property values. Flood damage, flooding in general, is a phenomenon of human development. Overbank water flows in the Trinity River, what do you got?
15.
How much do I have? What?
15.
I have 15 left?
You've got an infinite.
I don't need 15 left. Oh, okay, all right. I've been talking too fast. Okay, so the demand for land, the scarcity, I mean, this is sort of classic economics. Land for development is pretty scarce down here. And so wetland conversion makes some sense. When land is scarce, you're going to try to develop whatever land there is. And these numbers imply that that is in fact what's happening. And in those scarce watersheds, those watersheds where land is scarce, property values keep going up, which means that the cost of flooding keeps going up. And I don't know exactly how we get out of this process and this trend. We've already painted ourselves into a corner in the Buffalo Bayou and Brays Bayou watersheds. Now this is Buffalo Bayou below Addicks and Barker. Addicks and Barker, we drew a line there and said, you know, up above that, it's a different kind of system. But the flooding situation and the likelihood of property damage is sort of built into the system here. We still have the opportunity, actually, from about here. We could probably do some of the Armand Bayou area, as long as Tom keeps protecting those wetlands out there on the Armand Bayou Nature Center, and Johnson Space Center doesn't pour more concrete, and UH Clear Lake is okay. We're probably okay. And these, we have the opportunity to change policy and to do something, to recognize the value of those wetlands and to slow things down. But I don't know, maybe the Speed Center can figure out something to do about Brays Bayou. I know Phil has worked on it intensively for a long time. So bottom line, the economic cost of wetland conversion, the profit is immediate, but the cost is cumulative and long term. Every new acre of wetland that you convert in a watershed, you're upping the flood damage, you're increasing the likelihood of that damage, so you've got it's probably, I don't know whether it's exponential, it's sure as heck not linear in terms of that process. These conflicts between the ecosystem services of wetlands and the market value are more intense in the more highly developed watersheds. And if we're talking about having an impact on the development process, I would recommend that we start at the edges of that white blob and try to do something about what's happening as the development process spreads out, because what's gone on in the center is it's probably too expensive to fix. I don't know how you fix it. Maybe Mike Talbot can tell me how you fix it, but the edges are where we have the opportunity for a change in policy. And we know that flood avoidance can be improved by the protection of ecosystem services. In fact, in Sam's study, the land development codes and actually having protected areas like Armand Bio Nature Center give you the greatest benefit. They have the highest negative correlation to flood damage. So protecting land in the Addix-Barker protection, places like Armand Bio, the work that Legacy Land, no, they're not Legacy Land Trust anymore. Bioland Trust. Yeah, Bioland is doing, Katy Prairie, all those things are having a high negative correlation to flood damage. And then land development codes, not quite sure why we pride ourselves around Houston so much on unregulated development, but we probably need to rethink that. If we, the people in this room, I'm sure, would want to rethink that because you're interested in wetlands and the protection of those ecosystem services. Right now, as far as we can tell, land use decisions favor the economics of wetland conversion. I mean, it's just a process that goes on every year. We can show from the satellite images that every year there is some sort of loss, and that the system that we have that manages land development is not leading to no net loss of wetlands. That's it. So the bottom line is, if you want evaluation on ecosystem services, it's very complicated. We have enough data to say that there is a value to protecting wetlands in this area, and we can start there. We have been looking for money to try to start building those models for some time, and I don't know where it's going to come from. Deborah has been very helpful. What? We're trying, and so we would like to start building that model and to build it into a GIS system for this region, but it's going to take time and some resources. So.